Hello there and welcome to Tuesday in Parliament. On this programme, the government gives details of an investigation into child abuse in football.
No good will come from anybody trying to cover anything up. We need to know exactly what happened, how it happened, what went wrong, and make sure that those mistakes are not taken again.
Ministers set out plans to make top bosses' pay more transparent and accountable. And there's a mixed reaction to a proposal to move Parliament to the north of England.
I just wanted to ask whether we were quite sure that the people of the north would want Parliament in the north.
But first, ministers are set to write to all national sporting bodies asking them to redouble their efforts to protect children following accusations of child abuse in football. 5 police forces have already said they're investigating, and more than 20 former players have come forward. Answering an urgent question, the Culture, Media and Sports Secretary said children up and down the country were able to play football thanks to thousands of adults who were mostly volunteers. But where trust was abused, it could be devastating.
I pay tribute to those who have summoned up the courage to speak out. It is vital that they should know that their voices will be heard, whether they are speaking about historic crimes or anything that is happening today.
The Football Association has appointed a senior lawyer to investigate.
Today, my honourable friend, the Minister for Sport, will write to all national governing bodies to ask them to redouble their efforts in protecting children that play their sports. And additionally, I have spoken to Chief Constable Simon Bailey this morning, the National Police Lead for Child Abuse, and we have agreed that I will convene a meeting with him, the FA and others to discuss this situation.
The Professional Footballers Association have said that 6 football clubs have been named by victims. Over 20 former players have now come forward. 5 police forces across the country are opening up investigations, and FIFA are monitoring the situation closely. Mr. Speaker, I welcome the NSPCC opening up their hotlines, and they did indeed receive over 50 phone calls in the first 2 hours of opening. What else is the government doing to ensure victims have a safe place where they can speak out confidentially? This is vital.
The Minister said the NSPCC and the Players Association stood ready to help.
The FA's internal review must be a properly resourced investigation that looks at the culture within football that meant abuse took place for so long and went unreported and uninvestigated for so long. Would she further agree with me that if this report is to have credibility, it must be published in full in public?
No good will come from anybody trying to cover anything up. We need to know exactly what happened, how it happened, what went wrong, and make sure that those mistakes are not taken again.
Mr. Speaker, before I got elected to this place, I worked as a criminal barrister for 16 years. So I defended more than my fair share of paedophiles, I have to say. And it is undoubtedly the case that it takes huge courage for someone to come forward and to explain how they were abused as a child. It's also an unfortunate part of the particular wicked perversion that is of a paedophile, that they are particularly cunning and deceitful. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that we don't want a witch hunt, but we do need to be sure that everybody in sport involved in children understands the nature of these wicked, horrible people, and that's why they have to understand why it's so important they put in place rigorous measures to safeguard our children and keep them safe.
This last weekend, I stood on the touchline watching my son play for Millthorpe Corinthians against Kendal Wattsfield, and there's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of children every weekend playing football. This is our national game. I thoroughly respect what the FA are doing in terms of their investigation. This is no attempt to try and undermine them or to criticise them, but given this is the national game, given the scale of this potential problem, will she ensure that there is independence in this, there is resource put into it, and we don't just allow the sport to investigate itself?
I think many parents will be shocked to know that under changes brought in by the previous coalition government, there isn't a requirement for volunteers, such as a football coach, to have a DBS check if they are being supervised by someone in regulated activity. And this was raised many times when that bill was going through Parliament in the last Parliament. I wondered whether the Secretary of State might consider looking at that to give the reassurance to parents that children are kept as safe as possible.
I think the honourable lady needs to recognise that we need to make sure that safeguarding is done in a way that is actually effective. The DBS check is required for people who may be left alone with children. We need to make sure that those DBS checks are maintained and that the DBS is allowed to do its job. But of course, if as a result of these inquiries there are found to be failings, then I stand ready to work across government to make sure that safeguarding is done as robustly and appropriately as possible.
There's a big loophole, and there's a loophole for sports that don't have governing bodies, and there's a loophole where the people involved are self-employed, not employed by another person. Would the Secretary of State undertake to take this back and look at it? It will also be affecting music tuition.
Helen Goodman. The chief executives of FTSE 100 firms have a median salary of about £4 million a year, according to the High Pay Centre. That's 140 times the salary of an average worker. The government has unveiled proposals giving shareholders the right to approve pay packages. It's one of several measures in a new consultation paper on improving corporate governance. There are also plans to increase the connection between company boards and employees and to make private firms abide by governance rules observed by public companies. But Labour doubted whether the measures would tackle what it called the unacceptable face of capitalism.
There is no conflict between good corporate governance and profitability. Indeed, poor corporate governance is usually the prelude to financial disaster. This government is unequivocally and unashamedly pro-business, but we hold business to a high standard in doing so.
He said the government was seeking opinions on how to manage executive pay.
Members of this House will be aware that executive pay has grown much faster over the last 2 decades than pay generally, and at times is not in line with corporate performance. The document seeks views on this issue, in particular how to strengthen shareholder voting rights with a view to making them binding, encouraging shareholder engagement with executive pay and promoting greater transparency over pay.
Labour's Clive Lewis raised the collapse of BHS, leaving 11,000 people out of work and a huge pension deficit.
When we debated the fate of Sir Philip Green last month here in this chamber, I said that the most shocking thing about the whole affair is that everything he did was legal. A key question for today, Mr. Speaker, is whether anything that has been proposed would change that. Do these proposals pass the BHS test? Bringing private companies into the PLC rulebook strikes one as a move so targeted at a particular series of events that it will, I expect, come to be known as the BHS law. But had the proposals outlined today by the Secretary of State been in place 6 months ago, I'm not wholly convinced that we would have avoided the corporate governance scandals that have plagued the last summer.
I think there's a general consensus that the pay gap between executives and employees is too large, and we firmly believe that addressing that and properly valuing employees and investing in them is a key part of addressing the productivity problem that we have here. Companies need to be transparent about their pay. If their pay for executives is justifiable, then they must justify it, both to their staff and to their shareholders.
We all know that the dynamic growth on which our future depends will only be secured if there is public support for the free market system that generates that growth. To that end, what more can my right honourable friends say about making sure that we have working class representatives at the heart of decision making in our great companies, and also effective curbs on executive pay when pay follows failure?
My right honourable friend makes, as ever, his points in a powerful way. I think it is important that we have all the talents represented in our boardrooms. That is the way in which we will achieve corporate and industrial success in this country, and this is part of the case that we make in the Green Paper.
The pay of top executives and the bosses in particular has been absolutely scandalous whenever it did start. And some of these people are not very keen to pay their taxes. They use tax havens, as we know. But can I tell the Secretary of State this? The most effective way working people can defend themselves of their place of work is to belong to a trade union, for that union to be recognised, and time again, when the worst exploitation has been exposed, it's because there hasn't been trade union representation.
The Business Secretary said he hoped that the trade unions would contribute to the consultation on his plans. Now, inmates who attack officers could face tougher punishments as part of efforts to deal with a prison safety crisis in England and Wales. The move follows a 43% rise in assaults on staff in the year to June. Prison officers staged walkouts earlier this month over safety fears. Appearing before the Justice Committee, the Prisons Minister and the head of the National Offender Management Service also revealed action to tackle overcrowding and to block mobile phone signals in jails as part of a drive to tackle the smuggling of psychoactive substances to inmates.
Truth is, actually, under the coalition government, we took too many prison officers out, didn't we?
I think that's a simplistic analysis, if I would say, Mr. Chairman. There were efficiencies to be gained at the time, as the committee is very well aware of. But the game-changing situation, and the situation that did not exist in 2012-2013, new psychoactive substances. And I've had prison officers tell me that they would open a cell door and a prisoner who is calm and joyful in the morning, if they've taken one of these drugs by the evening, they become incredibly violent and would attack this very prison officer who they were having a good relationship with earlier in the day.
Psychoactive substances and the mobile phones that allowed the trade in them, he said, was driving the violence.
Mobile phones are illegal in prisons. Now, we have, since our last debate, we have made progress with the mobile network operators, and we have come to agreement with them where we will be able to deny and disrupt mobile phone signals in our prisons. We are starting with in 3 prisons. I can't go into the detail, obviously, because of the security reasons that underpin that. But that is significant progress because it would enable us to disrupt the criminal activity that underpins getting these things into our prison.
How quickly do you expect to see the impact on these safety indicators, on the reduction of these horrible, horrendous incidents in our prison? How quickly do you expect to see?
If you're asking me to give you a time frame, the best answer I can give you is that it will take time, but we are taking actions today to make sure that we deal with prisoner assaults today, that we deal with violence in our jails today, but also where prison officers are assaulted today, that there is swift justice. For example, I am looking at making sure that where there is an assault against a prison officer and someone is prosecuted, that they get a consecutive rather than a concurrent sentence. So we're taking a lot of actions today to deal with this situation.
Ministers have promised to recruit another 2,500 prison officers.
I just want to get an understanding as to whether or not those 2,500 are completely in addition to the 1,700 announced. And if so, how many prison officers you expect to be in post by the end of 2018?
The new money, 2,500 staff, it's all new staff. We're currently 800 below benchmark, but actually because we've got Payment Plus, where prison officers can opt to work more hours, that brings the 800 down to something like 334 below benchmark. But with our normal recruitment plus the 2,500, so the normal run rate plus the 2,500 that we're looking to recruit, I think that would take us to something like 8,000 staff, correct me if I'm wrong, by 2018 that we need to recruit.
MPs were also worried about overcrowding. With new prisons planned, how quickly could the situation be improved?
Yes, there will be a delay, but actually the delay we're talking about is the first of these prisons we're talking about will be opened by 2019-20, which in the whole scheme of things is, it's within sight, and that will make a big difference when that's delivered.
To what degree do you have prisoners now in doubling or tripling up in cells?
It's about 24% of prisoners are held in accommodation that was designed for fewer people than are in it. So either a single cell with 2 prisoners in it or a double cell with 3 prisoners.
And how quickly do you expect to be able to get to the point where cells are only holding the number of prisoners they were designed for?
Not within this Parliament or the next.
You're watching Tuesday in Parliament with me, Alicia McCarthy. The Chancellor, Philip Hammond, has given the strongest hint yet that the government's commitment to a guaranteed rise in pensions could be dropped after the next general election. The so-called triple lock was introduced by the coalition and ensures that the state pension rises each year by either inflation, average earnings growth or 2.5%, whichever is highest. In last week's autumn statement, Philip Hammond confirmed it would continue until 2020, but there would be a wide review of spending commitments beyond that. Labour's frontbencher cited figures from the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility, or OBR, which she said suggested pensioners could already be worse off by 2020.
A pensioner on the state pension will be £429 worse off by 2020, with only the triple lock preventing an even worse decline. After claiming the triple lock will now be subject to review in the autumn statement, can the Chancellor end the uncertainty and worry he has caused older people and join me in committing to preserve the triple lock throughout the lifetime of the next Parliament?
Well, Mr. Speaker, this now was worth waiting for. We have a firm commitment by the opposition to run the triple lock through the lifetime of the next Parliament. I wonder if the Honourable Lady knows how much money she has just spent. Without knowing the fiscal circumstances the country will face, what we have said, Mr. Speaker, and the only responsible thing to say, is that all the commitments that we have made for the duration of this Parliament, we will review at the spending review before the end of the Parliament, and we will decide then which ones we can afford to renew, which ones are appropriate to renew. I think it tells us, Mr. Speaker, everything we need to know about the opposition, that 3.5 years out they're willing to spray around commitments without any idea of what it's going to cost them.
The Shadow Chancellor turned to pictures in the newspapers showing a Conservative aide's notes on Brexit.
Last week's autumn statement should have been about providing answers to meet the challenges of Brexit and at least information on the options available. Instead, it appears the only information we can glean is from photos snatched of the notes of a senior Conservative official in Downing Street. But we now know in the light of that leak, today that many of the Chancellor's senior colleagues in government are reluctant to pursue the transitional deal being called for by businesses on leaving the EU. Will the Minister now provide some clarity by inviting the Treasury and the OBR to undertake a full assessment of the public finance implications of the range of policy options associated with Brexit, including access or not to the single market, in or out of the customs union, and the potential for transitional arrangements?
I have to tell the right honourable gentleman that's a normal part of what we do on a very regular basis, and he really shouldn't believe all he reads in newspapers, from researchers to backbenchers. It's hardly government policy.
Meanwhile, MPs have been told that any harm to the economy caused by Brexit is unlikely to be anywhere near as damaging as the 2008 financial crisis. Paul Johnson, the head of the Institute for Fiscal Studies think tank, said it was possible that the downturn predicted by many forecasters may not materialise, though things may turn out to be considerably worse. He told MPs on the Treasury Committee it was too early to be sure how the referendum vote would impact on the UK economy in the long term. But unlike in most periods, economic forecasters were at least able to be certain that there was some uncertainty ahead.
Presumably, when you use the word some, you really mean a great deal.
Well,
because there's much more than usual.
Well, there's known unknowns, as it were. I mean, as it turned out, we were subject to vast uncertainty in 2007 that we just didn't know about. And actually, even in 2010, when most forecasters were thinking the economy was going to grow much more strongly than it turned out to do. So actually, if you look back, you'll see that there were periods when outturns were vastly different to expectations. I think what's slightly different now is that we know that there are certain decision points, for example, whether we stay in the single market or not, and indeed uncertainties about how the economy will respond over the next couple of years, which we know are uncertain. Now, it will be, I don't think it's within most people's band of uncertainty that we'll have anything close to what happened in 2008. It's just that we know that there are some changes coming along, and we don't really know exactly how the economy will respond to them.
Paul Johnson from the IFS. A Plaid Cymru MP is calling for CCTV to be mandatory in abattoirs that slaughter horses. Animal welfare charities say while consumer pressure on supermarkets helps ensure humane conditions for some animals, as horse meat is not sold in the UK, there's far less demand on equine slaughterhouses to install CCTV. Opening a debate in Westminster Hall, Liz Saville-Roberts said doubts over the standards of practice at slaughterhouses was deterring owners from taking old or sick horses for slaughter.
Euthanasia by a vet and carcass disposal can cost more than £500, while an Ackerman may charge around £150. In contrast, an abattoir will pay for the horse, so affordability never has to impact the horse owner's decision.
One of the things that holds back the horse owners from sending their horses to an abattoir is their lack of confidence, and that the World Horse Welfare Survey shows that over half of the respondents would consider using an abattoir if CCTV was in place.
It may well be causing some horse owners the result of it being in delaying euthanasia, and this in itself causing welfare problems and distress. At the moment, DEFRA has said they wish to encourage a voluntary approach to installing CCTV. Welsh Government have also indicated that they support the use of CCTVs in slaughterhouses in Wales, but have failed to legislate to make that mandatory. It's clear this approach is not working. The FSA, in their board report of 21st September, confirmed that take-up of CCTV had plateaued at 49% in red meat slaughterhouses. Where slaughterhouses have CCTV, it may not be placed in the areas which allow them to monitor horse welfare. We do need a mandatory approach, I would beg.
The Minister argued CCTV wasn't a substitute for good practice.
Now, the Government therefore understands the desire for the use of CCTV in all slaughterhouses, although the Government is yet to be convinced that it should be a mandatory requirement. However, I do understand the calls for the Government to go further by introducing legislation to require slaughterhouses to have CCTV installed and for there to be unfettered access for official veterinarians to CCTV footage. And as I've made clear previously, the Government has never ruled out further action, and we do keep this issue under review.
George Eustace. Finally, we've been told for months now that Parliament is dropping to bits, literally. There's a very long list of very overdue repairs with leaky roofs, dodgy wiring and crumbling masonry. MPs and peers have been handed a report suggesting the best option would be to move them all out of the palace and find a new home elsewhere for 6 years while the building is repaired and renovated. But where should they go? One peer suggested a move to the north of England.
This then provides a new city, a new centre of government for the country, taking power to the powerhouse out of this congested place we're in, together with a new home for Parliament, and that only by something as radical and visionary as this will we ever tackle the problem of imbalance that so affects us all now.
Well, my lords, this is a radical suggestion. I must say, I feel Parliament should really be in the capital city, but you'll be relieved to hear it's not up to me. Indeed, it isn't even up to the government to decide. It's the decision for both houses.
I just wanted to ask whether we were quite sure that the people of the north would want Parliament in the north.
Well, I think the Right Reverend Plant has a very, very good point. I think if they've got any sense, they won't.
There is a nasty tone in some of this debate of people attacking our capital city. And is it not important, and I'm sure the noble lady will agree with me, that given that the people of London subsidise the rest of the country to the tune of billions of pounds each year, that perhaps it would make sense that before we go down this road of automatically deprecating London, we would remember that if the principle of devolution was followed and London had full fiscal autonomy, that would be a very satisfactory outcome as far as the people of London would be concerned.
Well, I think the noble lord certainly has a point. I mean, I think we feel London is our capital, but I don't think people here were denigrating that. I don't think noble lords were denigrating that. And they were talking about moving things to the north.
Another peer had a novel solution.
There might be merit in building a purpose-built ship, which would help British shipbuilders, would help British steel, and it could visit various parts of England when it was needed, and would be quite useful during recess as well.
Well, Lady Chisholm said that was a great idea, but she wouldn't be able to join in as she was often seasick. And that's it from us for now. But do join me at the same time tomorrow for another roundup of the best of the day here at Westminster, including the highlights from Prime Minister's questions. But until then, from me, Alicia McCarthy, goodbye.